Hey guys, in this video I will share with you my Grandmaster perspective on the best way to meet the move 1d4 by white, and you're also going to discover why this defense that I'll be showing you is the strongest way to meet d4 on objective and also on practical grounds. Now if you enjoyed this video, do make sure to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm and click the subscribe button, the red subscribe button, if you are new to the channel. So after d4, what is the strongest defense? I firmly believe that the best defense to 1d4 is a system known as the Semi-Slav Defence. So how do we get to the Semi-Slav? There's actually a few different ways to get to it, but I'm going to start by showing you the move order that is the most common one at the highest levels of play, and that is to go knight f6, c4, and then the move pawn to e6. And if white plays moves such as knight to f3, which is the most common one at higher levels of play, trying to develop as flexibly as possible. Then we go d5, so playing like a Queen's Gambit, but it's a Queen's Gambit declined. White is committed to move knight to f3. And then after the move knight to c3, the move c6 by black now characterizes the Semi-Slav Defense, where you'll notice this triangle pawn structure that is formed here with the pawns from f7 to e6 to d5, and into c6 and b7. You're drawing the triangle pyramid shape for you guys so you can see it. And there's actually quite a few different ways in which you can reach this position, but before I show that, I'll share with you what is it that makes the Semi-Slav such a powerful and effective opening. Well, in my experience, the Semi-Slav is one of the very few defenses against 1d4 that basically gives you very good chances for active counterplay and to fight from the initiative, but at the same time does it from a very solid strategic basis. So if you compare the other defense against d4, of course some of these defenses are objectively, according to computer analysis, as strong as a Semi-Slav, but from my own experience of trying just about every serious defense against d4 in my own games, they have some sort of practical problem or involve a much greater deal of risk, or maybe make it much harder for you to generate winning chances if your opponent wants to play very solidly. To give you an example, even if we take this position, there are other moves that black can play, such as the Queen's Gambit decline with bishop to e7, and I think that, saying that this system is, let's say, clearly weaker than c6, well, that would be a somewhat controversial opinion. I do think that c6 is a little bit stronger, though, because in bishop e7 there are some lines white can play where you just get a very safe position, and where black, in a lot of cases, basically only able to really play for a draw, and it's very hard to play for a win against a high-rated player, unless they are, let's say, really pushing hard for the win themselves. And also systems like, let's say, there are goes and various others. Again, nothing terribly wrong with them, but you are kind of risking a bit more, and somehow you have to play a bit more precisely in order to make the ideas work. Whereas in the Semi-Slav, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of different ideas that you can play. So to give an example, if we were to take a position like, let's say, after c6, well, the main moves for white are bishop to g5 and e3. And if we take bishop g5 as an example, the great thing is there are a lot of different ways in which you can play this system. So it's not like, let's say, a King's Indian defense with, g6, bishop g7, where, King's Indian's a perfectly good opening, but you have to find exactly the right move in a lot of positions, and often it's quite difficult to find those exact right moves without very deep preparation before the game, without which you might just end up in a very bad position out of the opening. But with the Semi-Slav, you kind of have a wide choice of options. Probably the very strongest option for black is to play the Moscow lines with h6, where, either they take and you get this nice bishop pair advantage to sort of make up for the fact that, you do have a bit less space and white has a bit of a lead in development, but theory has shown that with various plans, for example, g6, bishop g7 and castle short, you get a very nice flexible position and really have no reason whatsoever to complain as black. And if they go bishop h4, then you can go for these lines with dc4. And these lines are very complex, but they're also lines where you are, well, unlike a lot of other openings against 1d4, you actually are managing to be a pawn up in this position, and you really force white to play very precisely. Because most white openings in d4, they just play very safely. They have a lot of moves they can play, and even if they slightly mess up, the position is still quite playable for white. But obviously not here. All it takes is for white to make one or two mistakes, and they could simply just have a very bad position out of the opening. Of course, the same is true for black as well, that black also needs to be well prepared here against strong players, but it's definitely an example of how the Semi-Slav allows us to get very aggressive positions, but from a very solid and strategically sound basis, which maybe is less true of some other systems like the King's Indian or let's say the Grunfeld, where black is clearly making some clear strategic concessions in order to get that active counterplay, whereas in the Semi-Slav we don't really have to make the strategic concessions and we still get the active play that we are looking for. And of course, again, as I mentioned many times, a big advantage of the Semi-Slav is its flexibility. So you can also play, for example, a move knight b to d7 here, which is a more solid approach often with the idea of playing something like the Cambridge Springs with the move e3, and then after the move e3 to move queen a5, just using the pin on the knight that way, often with knight e4 or bishop b4 ideas to follow. So that's a more solid approach that, while probably it's not quite as strong as h6 objectively, it allows you to get a very playable and quite safe position without needing to know as much fury as in the h6 lines. And then there's also fun lines like the Botvinnik variation with dc4, where black ends up basically sacrificing a pawn, even though it looks like a pawn grab now, but gets a lot of active play, and these lines have been worked out to a draw in correspondence. So, the board play, usually one of the players ends up, going astray before that, because positions are very sharp and very unclear. So for those of you like very chaotic kind of play, this may well be to your taste. And as for the other major option for white in e3, well then, basically black can just play knight d7, and there are different lines that can be played, for example with queen c2. I've already done some videos before on the Semi-Slav for black, so this is just to show, again, just give a taste of the flexibility of black's position, that at this point here, if we take this tabia position as an example, there are already no less than 3 moves for black that are very decent. They're all quite similar in strength. My own personal favourite's been the move b5, just playing it like a Moran, where you just go bishop b7 and prepare the c5 break. Or in some case, let's say if they were to play a quick e4, for example, then naturally you go e5 and you're able to hit back in the centre that way, as sort of a plan B to the standard plan of preparing the c5 break, which obviously would give the bishop a very nice open diagonal. And again, black is getting this very nice active piece play with the nice bishops and a very harmonious piece placement without having to make any real strategic concessions. It's not like you have any real pawn weaknesses or a unsafe king, or you're just letting white take all the space, as is the case with most of the other defenses that one can play against 1d4. So it's a nice attacking system like that. And there are other approaches such as, for example, a6 to prepare the move b5. And also the more classical approach at e5, where those who are maybe more happy just to have a solid position and don't mind drawing with black against their opponent, if they're maybe same rating or higher rating, then this is also a very legitimate approach as well, showing that you can basically make the Semi-Slav your own opening. You can easily play in a way to fit your own style or your game situation, whether you want something more tactical, something sharper, or if you want something more strategic or something just very solid and safe. Well, you can easily find a system to your taste in the Semi-Slav. In fact, the Semi-Slav is such a difficult opening for white to really prove even the slightest advantage against, that actually a lot of players try to avoid the Semi-Slav when they play with the white pieces and play 1d4. And this is where we're going to get into how to meet d4, not just why is the Semi-Slav such a great opening. Of course, it's been played by a lot of world champions, Vishy Anand maybe being the most prominent exponent of the Semi-Slav, but also many of the other world's top players also played it. I know Garry Kasparov also was very, very successful with the Semi-Slav later in his career, and also Mikhail Botvinnik, another world champion, who played this opening a lot, and in fact Bishop g5, dc4 is actually named the Botvinnik variation after him, in case you were wondering. I don't think there's a Kasparov variation or a Anand variation of the Semi-Slav, but maybe there should be. But in any case, going back, of course, in terms of move orders, white can play different moves to try to avoid the Semi-Slav, where if we are using this move order of knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, c6 to get there, well then of course you also need to be ready for white's deviations, which include the Catalan with g3, which obviously falls outside the scope of this video to show. This is why I recommend against the Catalan and the Nimzo and so forth, but it's to give you an idea of the options you need to be ready for in order to complete your Semi-Slav repertoire against 1d4. And also other sidelines like e3, bishop g5 that you probably won't face very often, but again, good to have some sort of system ready for it to complete the repertoire. And also there are other systems white can play, such as playing knight c3, and Well, at this point you might have a very valid question of, well, why not just play the Semi-Slav via move order like d5, you know, just limiting white's options a little bit more. Say c4, e6, and okay, why don't you just play a Semi-Slav in this way, like knight c3, knight f6, and then if they play knight f3, then play the move c6 and just transpose. Well, that's all well and good, except that when you play this classical Queen's Gambit decline move order, I personally consider it slightly less precise, just because you give white the extra option of playing the move c takes d5, the exchange Queen's Gambit declined. And the difference is they get this pin with bishop g5, and, you know, if white is already committed to the move knight to f3, let's say, for example, if white played the move knight f3 in this position, then you're just very happy with this position as black, because you're able to go h6. You're able to get your bishop to the very nice diagonal here faster than white can go for e3 and bishop d3. So in the Semi-Slav version, if white plays cd5, it's just completely fine for black, right? But the difference here is that if you try to do the same thing after, say, e3, and let's say you try to play bishop f5 now, I could have thrown in h6, but it doesn't change that much to show the point. Well, here white gets this extra option of playing queen f3, and, you know, this is a line that exists. It's known as the short variation, where black, you know, goes for this endgame that, granted, black can hold this ending, and I have to admit that the Exchange QGD is very much playable for black as well, but after studying it, I found that, you know, in practice and positions, it's a lot easier for white to play. White's ideas are typically a lot more straightforward, and certainly white's score in practical games is quite a bit better than in the normal Semi-Slav main lines. And of course, not everyone just wants to go for a double pawns endgame where the maximum black can really hope for is a draw. So that is the sort of the reasoning that if white now plays, if we just go back to this position here, the difference is that now if white plays knight c3, you're not forced to play d5 and transpose back into the Queen's Gambit declined, the pure systems as it were. But we can play the Nimzo-Indian with bishop b4, and the Nimzo is another one of these systems that is so annoying for white to deal with due to just being so flexible and so adaptable and just such a strong opening played by virtually all of the top world champions that a lot of white players just don't want to allow the Nimzo. And I have to admit, in my own experience playing d4 as white, I really struggled to find a system against the Nimzo that I really was comfortable with. The main lines to look at are basically queen c2, the classical variation, and e3, the Rubinstein. And also various other alternatives like knight f3, f3, and some other moves that white can play as well that obviously one should have a system against for a complete repertoire, but again, this falls outside scope of this video to dive deeply into those moves. Now, as for the other possible move orders, of course, white doesn't have to play c4. There are all the different, you know, d-pawn special lines that white can play, like knight f3, knight c3, or developing the c1 bishop early to f4 or g5, but again, that's something you can't really avoid with after they play d4 anyway, so I'm just going to just mention it briefly as things you do need to be ready for to really complete your repertoire against d4, and then on that note, I'll move on to the d5 move order and show that you can actually reach the Semi-Slav via the d5 move order, and it's just as legitimate approach. I mean, personally, in my own games, I do slightly prefer the knight f6, e6 approach because it's a little bit more flexible, and I do think that the Nimzo-Indian is probably an opening that, if we're, say, comparing the Nimzo and the Semi-Slav, I think the Nimzo is an even stronger opening, but the difference is that obviously the opponent doesn't have to allow the Nimzo, so if they try to avoid the Nimzo, that's when we hit them with the Semi-Slav, is how it works. But let's say if maybe you don't want to have to learn the Nimzo, if you want to play a much more classical approach where maybe you avoid certain systems like the Catalan for white, for example, then you might like to play the d5 move order. And there are basically two main move orders you can use to reach the Semi-Slav. And the first one, and probably the one that most club players and online players think of when they think of the Semi-Slav, is they probably think of the Slav move order with c6 as such. The point being that after knight f3, knight to f6, and knight c3, which is the main line for white by quite some margin against the Slav defense. Well, here black's best move is absolutely to play the move e6. And again, transpose back into Semi-Slav, which of course I gave you a quick overview of a bit earlier in the video. And basically, you might be wondering, well, what exactly is the catch, Max? Why might the Slav move order to reach the Semi-Slav be less appealing than the Nimzo move order with knight f6 and e6, and only then going for the move d5? Well, there are a few different options that white has from the Slav move order that they don't have if you are using the Nimzo move order. Probably the most significant of these options from a theoretical perspective would be the Slow Slav line with E3. And you might be wondering, well, Max, why can't you just play E6 and play the Semi-Slav anyway? And the answer is you can, but there's a catch where you give white some extra options that are definitely practically a little bit tricky for black to deal with. So white is by no means forced to play knight c3 and transpose back into these Moran or anti-Moran Slav positions, with bishop d3, queen c2 sort of moves. But white can argue that by not playing the move knight c3, he has a bit more flexibility himself, and therefore could choose this up, for instance, putting the knight on d2, which, well, keeps the option maybe to go bishop d3 and play for an e4 break. Decided it can be a little bit annoying for black if he is not fully prepared for it. And maybe an even more unpleasant move order could be a move order such as b3, where white, instead of playing knight c3 directly, decides to go for this very flexible setup where he goes bishop d3 castles. And then depending on where the white, how black plays pieces, white will decide whether to put the knight on d2 or transpose maybe back into a good semi-Slav line with knight c3, say if black doesn't put the bishop on d6, for example. Now, with correct play, black can probably equalize in this position, but I do think that this line is slightly better for white compared to the normal semi-Slav lines that we saw before. And for that reason, you may prefer to go for a different setup, such as with bishop f5, which sort of is kind of the disadvantage of e3, that when white is not putting its early pressure against the d5 pawn, they give you time to go for a kind of reverse London, where bishop gets a nice diagonal. This has its own set of theory, but current modern theory does consider black to be doing quite fine in these positions, but again, you have to know what you're doing for a complete repertoire as black against e3. I guess I'm just happy to, play e6 and let them get some extra options against Semi-Slav, but again, you kind of have to be ready for it to complete your repertoire. Now, I guess speaking from a more practical perspective, there are also other moves white can play, and the main line that kind of put me off playing the Slav move order after playing it for many years of my playing career was the exchange variation with cd5, and obviously white can play cd5 in a lot of different moments, but kind of the point is that white does get this symmetrical structure where black has to be somewhat patient or somewhat resourceful to generate real winning chances. The modern move order you see at a high level these days to go bishop f4, and then play e3, sort of delaying knight c3 for move just to maybe reduce black's options a little bit. For example, queen b6 is not so effective in these cases. So after knight f6, knight c3 design, again, you kind of have to have some sort of system ready as black against the exchange. And, well, the good news is there are different moves you can play from the Chebanenko approach of playing a6, which might look like it's stopping knight to b5, but really the idea is more to go for bishop g4 against knight f3 and kind of pin the knight and sort of keep them guessing as to whether you will put the bishop on g4 or maybe do something a little bit different depending on what they play. And there's also more normal moves like developing the bishop to f5, which is very solid but does have a slightly drawish tendency if they play knight f3. You get this symmetrical position where white's obviously got half a tempo ahead and can try different moves like bishop b5, queen b3, and some other moves also that exist like very boring bishop d3. And in those lines, admittedly, you would be struggling a little bit to play for a win as black if white is very well prepared and quite a strong player. There is also a move order bishop g4, which kind of is to attempt to, combine the ideas of a6 and bishop f5, but again, I think I've given you enough time to work with in terms of finding a system that's sort of to your taste. So good news is that the Slav is also a very flexible opening, and even in these lines like the exchange, you do have options to choose between to get the kind of position that is, let's say, to your liking and maybe unbalanced enough that you can still outplay a weaker player. But that is probably, I would say, the main disadvantage of the Slav move order is that, well, they can play the Slow Slav with e3, and they can play the exchange, which are two lines that you don't really have to worry about with the other move orders that I'll be showing you, or at least for the exchange it's true. So if you want to avoid the kind of cd5 is boring, well, maybe boring is not the right word, but at least quite safe approach for white with symmetrical structure, then the third move order you can go for to reach the Semi-Slav that I have a high opinion of is one called the triangle move order. And that is where we play the move e6 in this position. And if they play knight f3, obviously you can just play knight f6 and head back to the positions that we saw before, with the d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5 move order. So that would be obviously very nice for black, but, well, what if white would have played a move knight c3 that I mentioned before, with the intention of maybe going into the exchange QGD. Well, now the triangle system is where we play the move of pawn to c6. And basically the idea is that, well, if white were to play a move like knight f3, just developing like in the Slav, well, then you can just play knight f6 and transpose back into the semi-Slav. Of course, there are independent lines for black. For example, the note boom with dc4 is quite an interesting system, though I do think the semi-Slav is objectively the stronger system for black. And there are also other move orders that white can play, like if they play e3, again, some players like to do weird things like play stonewall of f5, but again, strongest option is just to transpose back into the semi-Slav with knight f6, as white can hardly do better than to play the move knight f3 and transpose back into the semi-Slav like that. Now, this move order does give white one independent option, and it is a very sharp line where you kind of have to know what you're doing as black to kind of survive the opening. And that is the Marshall Gambit with e4. And the idea of this move order is basically that they want to play something like bishop b4 and bishop d2. And they're basically sacrificing the pawn with queen d4, but in return gain quite a lot of play. Both bishop e2 and knight e2 are moves, but bishop e2 is kind of the more common one. And here black has to be very precise, starting with the move knight a6 just to basically survive. So it is a line where you do need to have a good memory of the lines as black, because if either side forgets one move, but especially if black forgets one key theoretical move, then there is a risk they just lose out the opening after one mistake. But it's also like very sharp position, you do manage to get an extra pawn for the early suffering. So it is a line where black is absolutely holding his own and theoretically is just doing fine, but like I said, you need a good memory to kind of make these lines work from black's point of view. So that's maybe the one disadvantage of triangle move order. You do need to kind of memorize some moves after e4 to basically get out of the opening in good shape. But if you do, then there's no major disadvantage to this move order. And that's the advantage of, well, I guess, at least if you played an f3 c6 move order, you can try to avoid things like the Catalan or things like some exchange variations. But I think that the knight f6 move order is probably better against knight to f3, you know, when they can't really play a good exchange variation anymore because they played knight f3 too early, as I showed you a bit earlier in the video. You can then go bishop f5 and get a good setup like that. But it is true that if you do play c6, I think that in this case, well, moves like e3 or sort of gain in strength, because you don't really have better than knight f6 transposing into a semi-Slav, but like I said, it's not a pure semi-Slav where white has got some extra options without playing the move knight c3, so that's the reason why objectively knight f6 is probably the better move order, even though it does mean you have to deal with the Catalan, which I will admit has been annoying for me in the past, but there are different systems you can play against it, where the main branching points are basically to either play bishop to b4, there's sort of line where, well, where you can often put the bishop to e7 and say that bishop b2 makes it hard for him to get in their standard plan to e4 break. You could say it's almost like a harmful extra move for white in this case. Don't worry if you don't understand this though, because it's sort of like a line that mostly only grandmasters and professional players play. A line that might make a bit more sense to you would be to either play d takes c4 and play the open Catalan, or to play bishop to e7 and just play it very classically. Although here as well, I think it is probably in black's best interest to play the move d takes c4 and, you know, try to get his bishop to challenge the white bishop on the long diagonal. Moves like c6, you know, you can play in a closed way, but I think it's a bit less precise compared to the version where the bishop's already on d2. Because setups like knight d2 and playing for e4 are slightly annoying to deal with, and I personally would prefer to avoid them myself, but it still is a playable option for black as well if you are drawn to this kind of setup. So I think that pretty much covers the different move orders that black can play against the, black can to reach the semi-Slav against 1d4. So basically, just to quickly summarize, in terms of what move order is the best one for you to play, it really depends on what you want to allow and what you want to avoid. If you enjoy playing Nimzo-Indian and you don't overly mind allowing the Catalan, then I think that the knight f6, e6 move order, entering Nimzo against knight c3 and d5 against knight f3, I think that's going to be the best move order. Probably for the majority of people. I mean, it is a bit more work to learn a Nimzo, but I think it's well worth it because it's just such a great system and really want to teach you a lot about how to play good chess. And if that's not appealing to you, let's say you don't want to spend a lot of time learning the Nimzo, or maybe you just don't like the Catalan at all, and you just want to avoid it at all costs, well then I would recommend the Slav move order with d5, c4, c6. And then basically, going for the Semi-Slav via this move order and basically being ready for things like the Slow Slav and the Exchange, which can be slightly annoying if you're not ready for them, but as always, good preparation does neutralize these different options that white can play to avoid the Semi-Slav. And finally, if let's say you want to maybe reach the Semi-Slav, but you want to avoid maybe things like the Exchange variation, though you don't allow any c takes d5 in a good version, then I would recommend playing the triangle move order of e6, knight c3 and c6, which allows you to basically avoid the whole problem with the Exchange variation that we saw just before the Slav move order, but it does mean you have to be ready for the move e4, which is a little bit of a trade-off in comparison. So those are basically the different move orders. Obviously, you may decide to try a few different ones to see what you like best. But let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite move order to reach the Semi-Slav? What is the move order that you would play to reach the Semi-Slav as black? Let me know in the comments below. Let's get a good discussion going. And make sure to click on the suggested video to get some more fun Grandmaster Chess content. I'll see you in the next one. Get out of here.